Hey, what's up, my friend? Today's episode is going to be particularly special and very useful if you are a working mom or you've struggled with balancing all of the different calls and roles in your life. Trying to maintain that quote-unquote balance, and I'm putting it in quotes because is there such a thing as balance? It's something we're going to talk about today. But trying to maintain all of the different roles that you play can often lead to feelings of insufficiency or lots of guilt. So I have the pleasure of welcoming Dr. Sarah Visser from Calvin University on the show, and she's going to walk us through something called integrated living, which is going to help you think about all your different roles in a really fresh, freeing, and faithful way. So let's jump right in. It is my pleasure to welcome Dr. Sarah Visser. Dr. Visser, again, thank you for joining Moms Grab Coffee. I'm really excited about today's topic because I think it's something that a lot of us struggle with, a lot of us working moms in particular. There's always that push-pull, maybe we want to stay home, but we have to work, or vice versa. We feel like we have two God-given callings, one to be a mom, one to be, out in the workplace impacting our community. And so you have this idea of integrated living, which I absolutely love. I think it'll help us work through some of those feelings of insufficiency, maybe some feelings of guilt as well as we try to navigate both callings well. So can't wait to talk through that idea and figure out how we do this practically in our lives. But Dr. Visser, to start, can you tell us a little bit more about yourself?
Sure. Well, first of all, thanks for having me. This is one of my favorite things to think about and talk about. I'll say that it wasn't always that way. I think it's something I struggled a lot with. And so anytime I have a chance to sit down with other folks who are wrestling with some of these same questions and trying to figure out our calls in this world, I'm just really energized by that. So a little bit about me. I'm the proud mom of 3 kids, 2 teenagers, a senior in high school daughter, a son who's a sophomore in high school, and a 6th grade daughter. Been married to my husband, Matt, now for 22 years, and grew up in Michigan. I'm a graduate of Calvin University. And then we moved out to the West Coast for about 15 years. And then 8 years ago, moved back here to Grand Rapids, Michigan, where I now serve as executive vice president at Calvin University.
Amazing. And have you always been a working mom?
I have, yes. And, I grew up with a mom who was an elementary school teacher. She took about 12 years of a hiatus in the middle of her professional career to stay home full time. And so I think she developed in me this real sense that you can respond to a call that God has given you and that we don't have to bifurcate kind of the personal and professional in the ways that so much of society teaches us that we have to.
Yes, indeed. I think a lot of what our culture tells us to do as women is tough. It's a lot of responsibility that we already put upon ourselves. And then on top of that, you have society pushing these different ideas of what you should be doing as a mom or what you should not be doing as a mom across all different spaces, right?
That's
But
right.
especially, what really kills me inside is when we see those wars between moms, stay-at-home moms versus working moms. What's harder? What's easier? It's that's just hard for everyone.
That's
And
right.
so let's get into the idea of integrated living. What is it, and what does it mean?
Yeah, it's sometimes a complicated thing to try to describe, and yet I think it's pretty simplistic at the heart of it. When I think about integrated living, I think about how are we, I'll use the example of women. I think it's all people, but how are we as women invited to bring our whole selves into everything that we do? I remember as a younger woman, I was a new mom. I was a young professional, so had graduated from college and was kind of exploring this world of professional work outside the home. And I remember thinking, oh, I'm on the cusp of this really big decision. What am I going to choose? Where am I going to go? And on one hand, you referenced earlier that we feel so guilty. I relate to that. On one hand, I felt really guilty because I felt like, is it selfish for me to even be wrestling with this question of choice, knowing that not all women have the luxury of choice when it comes to thinking about paid professional work, who can stay home, who can't stay home, what's the more noble calling. So I'm on the cusp of this decision. And I remember thinking through the concept of balance because I heard a lot of people talking about, okay, you just need to, find the perfect balance
Mhm.
between work and life.
Yeah.
And I thought, but my faith lens tells me that all of life is ministry, right?
Mhm.
That
Mhm.
it's not like, okay, you're called to do this in this sphere and you're called to do this in this sphere. Is that as a Christ follower, I'm called to do that in all walks of life. And how do I do that? How do I bring my whole self? Sometimes that's going to be in professional settings. All the time that's going to be in with my family. And I started thinking about, I kind of reject this notion of balance. People
Mhm.
kept saying, could you come and speak about this? And I thought, I don't know if I believe balance is really possible. I don't know many people in my life, and rarely in my own life do I feel like I'm in perfect balance, where I'm just juggling all the things in this beautiful, perfect way. What I do experience is a lot of a need to surrender and to say, okay, God, what are you doing in me? What are you calling me into? How do I bring all of that into what's in front of me and try to do all of it from a place of faithfulness and presence?
Yeah, so when you talk about whole self, what do you exactly mean? Do you mean so when you're in your workspace, mentally you're fully there, emotionally you're fully there? Is that what you mean when you say whole self?
It is what I mean. Yeah. So
Okay.
I remember again as a new professional that I had counsel, and often it was from older men who were saying things like, "Well, remember, we're in a professional setting, and so you're going to want to try to find ways not to talk about your family too much." Or
Hmm.
I'm inherently an emotional person. Now, I like to think I've learned how to keep that in check. I'm not just like bursting into tears all the time, but I am somebody who feels really deeply, and I just can't turn that off. And so when I think about stepping into these professional contexts where, we're dealing with hard things, when I'm sitting across the table from somebody who's experiencing pain or hurt or brokenness, whether that's in the workplace or in their own personal lives, I feel that part of my call is to really sit in that with them and to find ways to relate. And that's counter to some of the messages that I think are out there about, what is this demeanor of professionalism, and how you kind of have this professional persona and then you have like your family persona. It's not
Mhm.
to say that there aren't important ways that we work in those different contexts, right? I'm going to be myself with my family in ways that in a really um, high stakes board meeting, I'm not just unpacking everything that we ate for dinner last night, that kind of thing.
Right.
But the essential element of who I am and who I've been created to be, the ways that I lead, the ways that I am wired to feel and connect, all of that matters in all of the contexts that I'm called into.
I like the fact that you address the work-life balance because that's kind of, where my mind goes. It's what we hear a lot, right? And when I think about work-life balance, there are two things. One is I imagine that I forgot what you call it, but it's that weight thing. What is that called? The weight thing that has the two things, one on the left, one on the right, and they're an equal weight to each
Oh,
other.
like the scale or the
Yes,
balance.
yes,
Yeah.
balance.
It's the
But
balance. Yeah.
to me, it's like, okay, how do you keep that steady? And then the second thing is, okay, we're going to compartmentalize. Like your work life doesn't seep into your family life and vice versa. And there's certainly, where it makes sense, certainly it does need to be compartmentalized to a certain degree. But, that's not the way life works, right?
Mhm,
Whether,
mhm.
we're at work and we have to go pick up our kid because they're sick, or you're at home and you have to prepare for, important meeting the next day. Those things are going to naturally integrate themselves.
Mhm.
And so I love just the phrase integrated living because I feel like that's real.
Mhm.
That reflects, our daily lives.
Right. Yeah, I'm going to use another metaphor. So I am not a water skier, but if I was, I have tried.
Yeah.
We're coming
Right.
off of this beautiful Michigan summer
Mhm.
where lots of people are out on the lake, and
Mhm.
when I think about whether it's learning to water ski or learning to ride a bike, there's this sense where you're trying to get up on top of the water, right? And you're
Mhm.
you're holding on to something, and there's things being thrown at you, meaning waves and water and
Yeah.
ripples, And you can do all the technical things and it still doesn't work if you're not paying attention to all the things, right? So
Mhm.
what is your grip like? And what are your, at what angle are your knees bent? And are you paying attention to where the wind is and the ways that the choppy waves are coming at you?
Yeah.
Um, that's a little bit what it feels like sometimes to be a mom, right?
Yes,
And whether you work inside the home or outside of the home, you've got all these things that are thrown at you and you're juggling and you're just trying to pay attention to all the things and to, we use terms like seek balance because you really are trying to find your equilibrium in the midst of all of that.
Mhm.
And some of the best advice I've ever been given is when the world feels crazy, pay attention better, meaning be attentive to what's happening. And that's true when you're trying to learn to water ski, or like I said, when you're trying to ride a bike. You have to think about all the things at the same time. It
Mhm.
doesn't mean, though, that there aren't times when certain aspects of that experience need your attention more, right?
Right. Yeah.
And that's exactly what I experience in this kind of juggle between Sarah, the workplace professional, Sarah, the mom, Sarah, the community member, church member, Sarah, the wife, friend, all those different spheres of our lives and identities. Is that there's going to be times. Yesterday, I get a text, "Oh, your son's soccer game got moved up to 4 p.m." Well, I'm like, you know what? I want to be there. It's important to me to be there. And so I'm going to shuffle my schedule a little bit. Now, a couple of nights ago, something got rescheduled. I had a board meeting at night. And even though inside I'm like, oh, I hate to miss, the kind of family home stuff that evening. For me to say to my kids, you know what, this is an important meeting and this is the role that I'm being asked to play in this meeting. And I think it's important that I'm there and I wanted you to know that's where I'll be.
Mhm.
I think that models for them too a sense of I'm trying to respond faithfully to the places that I've been called to be.
Yeah.
And I think we can get caught though in that sometimes and say like, okay, well then you have to be all things to all people and you just keep,
Mhm.
pouring yourself out in such a way that you get really depleted. And that actually makes me circle back to that idea of attentiveness too.
Mm.
Um, I'm paying attention to the different things that are happening around me, but I also have to pay really deep attention to what's happening in my own soul. And what's the motivation inside of what I'm doing, right? Is it so that I'm making a name for myself or so that I'm, focused about material on material things, or because I want to be the best at something, or am I really authentically responding to a sense of like this is who I've been created to be, and part of the way that I show gratitude for that is living into that call.
Yeah. So what's important, you're going to say yes to a lot of things, especially if they align to your call, but you're also going to say no to a lot of things. And the
That's
way
right.
you're making those decisions is through faith and making sure that they are, consistent with your obedience to God, your soul. So, what does that practically look like? Like, how do you make sure you're saying yes to the right things and no to the right things?
Yeah, I think one of the principles that has been formational for me is to think about the why that underlies those things. So I referenced that a little bit when I talked about kind of what is the motivation. For me, one of the things I know, I'm busy, right? I have a very busy job that demands a lot of attention and brings a lot of stressors.
Mhm.
And I also have a very active family, right? We're kind of in the thick of things. I've got 11-year-old, 15-year-old, 17-year-old. They're in the thick of life. Not all of them can drive, so we're
Yeah.
often still doing the chauffeur thing. We've got different schools that we're pulled into. It is very easy to be distracted away from the core thing. And the core thing for me is my faith. It is the center point of it all. And so I spend a lot of time trying to, some people say like, oh, it's self-care and it's, finding time to retreat away. Well, for me, it's about connecting to the source so that when just like anything, you can use the cell phone. I can use my cell phone all day. If it's not connected to the source, no matter how hard it's working, it's going to shut down. And so for me, I'm constantly trying to figure out what is this grounded in? Is my sense of hurriedness and busyness distracting me from the source,
Mhm.
from the center of that call? And constantly checking those things. So, I'll have opportunities like, oh, could you serve on this board or could you join this committee? And I have to really think about, well, hopefully they're all good, right? Like hopefully I'm being invited into it because it's worthwhile. But thinking about what does it mean if I say yes to this, then you're always saying no to something. And sometimes when I'm saying no to things, it's because it's distracting me from the things that I think are the biggest things we're called to right then. Just talking to students. So I work at a university. We just welcome students back. And, first time students in college, we're trying to help them understand, like, you're making your own decisions and you show up and the consequences are yours. And
Yeah.
how do you learn when to say yes and when to say no? And so found myself using the age old metaphor of like, look, pretend you have a glass vase and you've got these big rocks. And you've got a bunch of millions of little pebbles. And you've got medium-sized rocks. If you fill your life with all the little pebbles that sometimes feel like maybe good and beautiful things, but they're not the big rocks. They're not the things that your life is kind of centered on, and the chief calls that you have at that period in your life. And you can't fit everything in that vase. But if you start with the big rocks, and then you slowly fill in the smaller rocks, you end up having this beautiful vase
Yeah.
that has a beautiful texture, and somehow things fit, not because of you, not because you found an eloquent way to work that all together, but because you prioritize the right things. And so for me, that's faith and that's family. It's a sense of being called into community and being called into professional work. But when I do those things, trying to figure out what is the strain of Sarah that weaves through all of that. My vocation is not a career. My vocation is really my call, the way that God uniquely crafted me, and how I bring all of that into every setting that I'm in. That's me pursuing faithful vocation.
Pursuing your faith, building your faith on a
Mhm.
daily basis, does that look like, prayer? Does that look like reading a chapter in the Bible every day? Or how do you make sure that your faith is strong?
Yeah. So one of the things that I think when I was younger, and I'm talking teenage years and even into my early adulthood, sometimes I felt like, okay, it's all about the regimen, right? So much like working out,
Yeah.
like what is my workout plan for the week? What's my
Right.
devotional plan for the week? Now, don't hear me say that I don't agree with that, because I actually do. There are rhythms, and rhythms are important
Yes.
to our life. But I've tried to become less prescriptive about that. So there are lots of practices that are part of my everyday life, but it doesn't necessarily look the same every single day. So you've referenced prayer and devotional scripture reading. Those are important parts to my daily practice. But I also find ways to weave in books, right? So if there are particular topics that I'm thinking about, and usually it's around leadership, right? I'm thinking about, okay, what does leadership mean in the context of work and of home and again, of community and church? So finding ways really to put everything that I'm engaging through this lens. So I spend a lot of time just reflecting and journaling. I am an early riser. When I was working on my graduate degrees, partially because I was pregnant or I had young children in the home, often the only time I had that was just me and time and space to really think the way I needed to think to be able to output research and such was early in the morning. So that meant that I got in this habit of waking up like at 4 a.m. and that 4 to 6 a.m. time it became really sacred space, not because of the, kind of output I was doing on the academic side of things, but because the world was quiet in ways that most of my daily life is not quiet. And so paying attention to, sitting in silence and embracing solitude when it's there, or finding ways to create silence and solitude has been a really important part of my spiritual formation practices. The other thing I'd say is doing that in community. So finding ways, whether that's through, sometimes that's small groups, sometimes the most profound way I hear the voice of God is sitting across from somebody over a cup of coffee, which is why I like your podcast, because
Yes.
you're sharing life, you're sharing stories together. We're created to be in community. So what are the ways that God reveals truth through someone else's story or through someone else reflecting back to us God's truth. That's been really important. And spiritual direction, which was something I came to later in life, meaning finding somebody who's actually kind of a professional role is to walk alongside and to help me cultivate attentiveness. So I'll meet with a spiritual director, and they will, before that meeting, they're spending time prayerfully asking the Lord, what is it that I can share with Sarah? And it's scripture, right? And they'll kind of take me through almost like an individualized Bible study, right? To help me unpack, like, okay, how might the Lord be speaking to you through this? And how might that relate to some of the things that you're wrestling with and trying to figure out? And then what do you do with a result of that? How then should you live as a result of that? So it's almost like individualized spiritual coaching. And that has been really, really meaningful and formational to me these past few years.
Yeah, that's interesting. Is that like a life coach?
It is. Yeah, it's actually called a spiritual director or spiritual formation.
Oh, I've not heard of that before.
Yeah, you know what? I hadn't either. As I don't, it comes from a more contemplative practice than some of the denominations I've been a part of in the past. And what I love about spiritual direction is that it's all Christ followers, but from a wide variety of different denominational backgrounds. And I think it's that sense of when you step into maybe a congregational setting and it's different than what you grew up with or different from what you're familiar with, and all of a sudden you just see God in a new way, and you think like, wow, that expanded the scope or the horizon of what I understood about connecting with God and how that's done. And that has been really, really valuable to me, is the sense of being still and having somebody ask questions that are really heart and soul questions that open me up to new ways of thinking about, oh, what is God trying to say? And then again, how do I respond to that in my life and work?
Yeah. Going back to bringing your whole self into all of your God-given callings, you would have more peace in doing that, especially if you are struggling between, family time and work time. How much time am I giving to my family? How much time am I spending at work? And, they're those feeling at odds with each other. I feel like there would be more peace if you know that you are in your God-given calling. I think as moms, okay, that is such a blessing. That feels almost like yes, of course, this is a God-given calling. It's a blessing to be a mother and to be called to be a mother. But when it comes to work, whether that is in your current position, whether you are thinking about going to work for whatever reason, how can we get to a place, or how did you get to a place where you felt at peace to say, okay, this is a God-given calling. I know I'm being obedient to the Lord, and therefore I can bring my full self into this?
Yeah, it's a great question. And to be honest, I think it's something that I still wrestle with. Like, I just want to name that it's not like you come to this utopian place of like,
I wish, right? It's so great.
Yeah. Like, oh, good. Finally.
Yeah.
I do think there's, it's kind of like sanctification, right? Like you are working through this process, and sometimes you feel like, wow, like I'm not where I used to be, and I'm in a better place with all of this. And then you have these reminders where you're like, wow, I'm still really human and broken and needy and all those things.
On the
Which,
daily.
I love this idea that like shalom is not peace in the absence of chaos. It's like how you experience peace in the midst of the chaos. And I so often I'm like, yeah, that's kind of my life. Like it can feel super chaotic on all sides. But this constant remembering of like, what is it about and what is it for? There have been seasons in my life where I have really wrestled, whether it's with guilt or, I remember even the call to come back to my current place of work. So we were living in Southern California, and through a nomination process and lots of different conversations, what was on my horizon was this opportunity at Calvin University. And I struggled probably about 3 or 4 months with feeling like I don't really want to be the mom that's going to uproot my family and leave a faith community that I loved, a job that I really liked, our community and our neighbors and our friends, just for a job. Like in my mind, I thought that feels so selfish, and that feels like it was about me. And I had like my husband, my best friend, I had voices that were saying to me, um, you're actually making it more about you
Mm,
than maybe you think you are. And so it's kind of this noble sense of like, I don't want to be the mom that does that. But what if it's bigger than that? What if it's this sense of like God's presenting something to you? Are you
mm,
asking the right questions? And in that season of my life, I was really overwhelmed, wrestling with lots of things. I'm really happy with all the things I was doing, but kind of struggling with like, is God inviting me into this new thing?
mhm,
And so I committed through prayer. I was like, you know what? I'm going to pay attention. And my daily practice was literally in a journal. I would write down the most like pressing question in my mind.
mhm,
And sometimes the questions were like, oh, how is this going to impact my daughter? Right. And I'd write
mm.
that down.
Yeah.
Or sometimes it was like, I'm really dealing with imposter syndrome here. Like, I just don't think I'm ready for that kind of gig or that kind of role. Or I'm afraid about what it means to start over in a new place without a community. And
Mm,
every time, I mean, it was to the point where I could probably write a book on it. Like every time I would write those questions down, within 24 to 48 hours, there would be some pretty clear answer to the
mm,
question. Um, and the way that it would happen was, which was really moving to me, is that it would always be in the context of how I was asking the question. So for instance, I'd be wrestling with like, what impact would this have on one of my daughters, who is our kind of shyer, reserved, doesn't like change kind of daughter.
mhm.
And within 24 hours, she was asking me questions and saying things, not knowing anything about what, her dad and I were deliberating and trying to discern and pray about. She was saying things like, don't you think that God makes things okay? Don't you think God
My
tells us where we should
gosh.
go? Things that I'm like, first of all,
Wow.
a 7-year-old shouldn't say things like that. Like, how do you even know? Um,
That's
and it would
amazing.
just be these amazing ways that I would see the Lord show up and answer. And all that was asked of me in that moment was to be really honest with my insecurities and my fears and my questions.
Mm,
And that was such a lesson for me in life and leading and mothering and all those things, that, we're invited not to come perfectly organized and put together with a sense of everything we're called into, but we're invited. That's part of bringing our whole selves. Bring the questions, bring the
yeah.
insecurities, bring the fears and the guilt, and put that in front of God and just see what God does. God shows up,
Yeah.
and that breeds so much peace.
Mm,
That's always my answer. How do you know if you're supposed to take a step or you're supposed to do the thing? Um, Pray for peace. And if you don't have
mm,
peace, lay those questions in front, and either God will bring the peace, or the absence of peace is the answer.
mm.
Because I believe we're invited into that.
Yes, that is such a perfect example of how God not only responds to us, but then
Mhm.
also addresses a lot of the mom guilt we might be feeling when we are not with our family. Because time is a constant. We choose how to spend our time, right? And, our kids are growing up every day. Maybe some of us are wrestling with, our kids are growing up every day, or the jobs will be there, but we still want to, step into a job now. We don't want to wait. I feel like that's a lot of the struggle that moms
Mhm.
face, and the fact that he can speak through your daughter when you were going through that challenge, trying to make the right decision, maybe
Yeah.
wrestling with, spending family time. You certainly were wrestling with how it's going to impact your children. He's not only taking care of your callings within the community, but also your calling as a mom. So,
That's right.
gosh, that's such a beautiful example. Well, Dr. Visser, this has been so amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all your wisdom today. I hope that a lot of moms feel more at peace with where they are. Dr. Visser would love to give moms a chance to connect with you and learn more about your work. Where can they go?
Yeah, I'd encourage them to seek me out. The Calvin University website's the best place to get in touch with me. And yeah, just grateful for the opportunity to connect with moms everywhere. I think this is a really sacred call. It's a piece of our calling. And just excited for the opportunity to share more of my story. And I learn from moms every day. So hopefully this will be a blessing to those out there.
If you found today's episode helpful and you know someone else who would really benefit from it, Share this episode with them. You could do so right within your podcast app, or you could send them to momscribecoffee.com. Okay, that's a wrap for today, and I hope you have a beautiful, hope-filled, blessed week. And I'll catch you again next time for a cup of coffee with a side of faith, wisdom, and hope.